The stagecoach lurched violently as it hit another rut in the winding dirt road, sending Fiona Zeller's stomach into a nauseating flip that made her grasp the leather strap tighter, her knuckles white as bone. It was September 1875, and she had been traveling for nearly 2 weeks from Philadelphia to Bentonville, Arkansas, to meet the man she was to marry, a man she had never met, but who had written her such beautiful, promising letters that she had agreed to be his bride. The late summer heat was oppressive, even with the canvas flaps of the coach tied up to let in what little breeze there was. Fiona's throat felt like sandpaper, and the pounding in her head had only worsened over the past 3 days. She hadn't kept food down since yesterday morning, and the water from her canteen now tasted like metal on her parched tongue. "Not much longer now, miss," the driver called down. "Bentonville's just beyond that ridge." Fiona tried to smile in acknowledgement, but even that small movement cost her precious energy. At 22, she had never been this far from home, never felt so alone, and certainly never felt this ill. Her chestnut hair, once neatly pinned beneath her bonnet, now stuck to her feverish skin in damp tendrils. The pretty blue traveling dress she had sewn especially for her arrival was wrinkled and stained with dust. The coach rounded a bend and began its descent into a valley where Bentonville sprawled beneath the afternoon sun. Fiona tried to focus on the town that would be her new home, but black spots danced at the edges of her vision. She fumbled for her reticule, desperate to find the letter with Xavier Quentin's address and description. "Whoa there," the driver called to his horses as they entered the town proper. The main street was busy with afternoon activity, merchants closing shop, cowboys leading their horses to the livery, women gathering children for the journey home. The stagecoach rolled to a stop in front of the station, and Fiona heard the driver jump down from his seat. When the door opened, she tried to stand, but her legs refused to support her weight. "Miss, are you all right?" the driver asked, concern etching his weathered face. "I need to find Xavier Quentin," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm his bride." The driver's eyes widened. "You're Xavier's mail-order bride. Well, I'll be. He's been talking about your arrival for weeks." He looked at her more carefully. "Miss, you don't look well at all." "I'll be fine," she insisted, though the words cost her dearly. She tried again to stand, and this time managed to stagger to the door. The driver helped her down, but as soon as her feet touched the dusty street, the world tilted alarmingly. The last thing Fiona heard before darkness claimed her was the driver's panicked shout. Xavier Quentin was leading his mare to the blacksmith when he heard the commotion. At 30 years old, he had long since learned to keep his distance from the town's more raucous elements, preferring the solitude of his ranch 10 miles outside of Bentonville. But something in the shouting caught his attention, a name that sounded like his own. He turned, squinting against the late afternoon sun, and saw a crowd gathering at the stagecoach station. His heart skipped a beat. Today was the day Fiona Zeller was supposed to arrive. For 6 months, they had exchanged letters after she had responded to his advertisement for a wife in a Philadelphia newspaper. Her words had been thoughtful, her penmanship delicate, and somewhere along the line, he'd begun to dream about the woman behind the letters. Xavier. The stagecoach driver, Bill Thornton, was waving frantically. "Xavier, she's here, but something's wrong." Xavier handed the mare's reins to a nearby boy and sprinted across the street. The crowd parted as he approached, revealing a young woman collapsed on the wooden platform of the station. Her face was flushed with fever, her breathing shallow. "Fiona," Xavier knelt beside her, laying a gentle hand on her forehead, her skin burned against his palm. "Fiona, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, revealing glimpses of hazel eyes clouded with fever. "Xavier." She whispered, her voice weak and uncertain. "I'm here," he assured her, then looked up at the crowd. "Someone fetch Doc Sullivan, quickly." A young boy darted off while Xavier carefully gathered Fiona in his arms. She was lighter than he expected, and her body radiated heat through the fabric of her traveling dress. "My bags," she murmured against his shoulder. "Don't worry about that now," Xavier said, his voice gentle but firm. "We need to get you to the doctor." "Is she gonna be all right, Xavier?" asked Martha Hendricks, the owner of the town's general store, her face pinched with concern. "She will be," Xavier replied with more confidence than he felt. "Probably just exhaustion from the journey. The stage from Little Rock is rough this time of year." Doc Sullivan arrived minutes later, his medical bag in hand and his spectacles perched precariously on his nose. He was a man in his 60s with a steady hand and kind eyes that had seen the birth and death of most of Bentonville's residents. "Bring her into my office," the doctor instructed, leading the way across the street to a small white building with a sign that read, "J. Sullivan, M.D." Inside, Xavier placed Fiona on the examination table as gently as if she were made of porcelain. Her eyes opened again, confusion evident in their depths. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "You're in Bentonville," Xavier told her, keeping his voice calm. "You're safe. This is Doc Sullivan, and he's going to take good care of you." Doc Sullivan examined Fiona with practiced efficiency, checking her pulse, listening to her breathing and feeling her glands. "She's got a high fever," he announced, "and she's severely dehydrated. Might be influenza, or it could be something she picked up on the journey. Hard to say for certain." "What can we do?" Xavier asked, unable to take his eyes off Fiona's pale face. This wasn't how he had imagined their first meeting, not at all. In his mind, she would step down from the coach with a smile, perhaps shy but eager to begin their life together. He would take her hand, welcome her to Bentonville, and they would have dinner at the hotel while getting to know each other beyond their letters. "She needs rest, plenty of fluids and cool compresses to bring down the fever," Doc Sullivan replied, mixing a powder into a glass of water. "Help me get her to drink this. It's quinine with a bit of willow bark to help with the fever." Xavier supported Fiona's head as she sipped the bitter medicine, grimacing weakly. "Where will you take her?" Doc Sullivan asked once she had finished drinking. "The hotel," Xavier hesitated. His ranch was a good hour's ride from town, too far to transport someone in Fiona's condition. The hotel was the logical choice, but something within him rebelled at the thought of leaving her in the care of strangers. "She can stay at my place in town," he decided. "The apartment above the saddle shop. I've been keeping it since I bought the ranch. It's small, but it's clean, and I can look after her there." Doc Sullivan raised an eyebrow. "People might talk, Xavier. You two aren't married yet. We'll have Mrs. Hendricks stay as chaperone," Xavier replied firmly. "I'll sleep at the livery if I have to, but I won't leave her alone." The doctor nodded, satisfied. "I'll stop by in the morning to check on her. If her fever doesn't break by tomorrow, we may need to consider more aggressive treatment." Xavier gathered Fiona once more, noticing that she felt even hotter against his chest. Her eyes were closed, her breathing labored. "Rest as long as needed," he whispered to her as he carried her out into the fading light of day. "I'll be right here." The apartment above the saddle shop was indeed small, just 2 rooms. A main living space with a small iron stove and a bedroom with a narrow bed. Xavier had maintained it as a place to stay when business kept him in town too late to return to the ranch. It was sparsely furnished but meticulously clean. Mrs. Hendricks had hurried ahead to prepare the place, and by the time Xavier arrived with Fiona, the bed was turned down and a kettle was already heating on the stove. "I brought some of my night dresses, Mrs. Hendricks said, bustling around the room. "They might be a bit large on her, but they'll be more comfortable than that traveling dress, and I've sent my boy to fetch her luggage from the station." "Thank you, Martha," Xavier said, laying Fiona gently on the bed. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "Nonsense," Mrs. Hendricks replied, but her cheeks pinked with pleasure. "You've done plenty for this town. It's about time we return the favor." She shooed Xavier toward the door. "Now, you go fetch some fresh water from the well while I help the poor dear change, and bring back some ice from the ice house if there's any left." Xavier nodded and stepped outside, closing the door behind him. For a moment, he leaned against the wall, taking a deep breath. This was not at all how he had planned to welcome Fiona to Bentonville. In his last letter, he had described the dinner he would prepare, the flowers he would have waiting, the gentle introduction to the town that would be her new home. Instead, their first real interaction had been her collapse and his panic. He hadn't even properly introduced himself. "Some husband you'll make," he muttered to himself as he headed for the well. But as he drew the water, a determination settled over him. He would care for her, nurse her back to health, and make sure she knew that she had made the right choice in coming to Arkansas, in choosing him. By the time Xavier returned with water and a block of ice wrapped in burlap, Mrs. Hendricks had changed Fiona into a white cotton nightgown and had her tucked beneath a light sheet. "She's burning up," Mrs. Hendricks whispered. "The poor thing said she's been feeling ill for 3 days now but didn't want to delay her arrival. Stubborn, that one." Xavier couldn't help but smile slightly. Stubbornness was a quality he had come to admire in Fiona through her letters, her determination to make her own way, to seek a new life in the West, despite her family's objections. That same determination had likely kept her going through the grueling journey, even as illness took hold. "I'll stay with her tonight," Mrs. Hendricks continued. "You can take the chair if you insist on staying, but you should get some rest too. Tomorrow's likely to be a long day." Xavier nodded, too exhausted to argue. He helped Mrs. Hendricks prepare cool compresses for Fiona's forehead and set up a system to replace them regularly throughout the night. Then he settled into the wooden chair beside the bed, watching as Fiona's chest rose and fell with her labored breathing. In the dim light of the oil lamp, he could finally take a proper look at the woman who was to be his wife. She was younger than he had expected, probably in her early 20s. Her chestnut hair, damp with sweat, framed a heart-shaped face with delicate features. Despite the flush of fever, he could see that her complexion was fair, speaking to her Eastern upbringing. She was beautiful, more so than he had dared to hope, and the sudden protective surge he felt toward her caught him by surprise. Until now, their arrangement had been practical. He needed a wife to help with the ranch and to provide companionship, and she needed a fresh start away from whatever had driven her to answer an advertisement for a mail-order bride. But watching her fight for each breath, seeing her vulnerability, Xavier realized that his feelings had already progressed beyond the practical. Through their letters, he had come to care for the woman behind the words. Now, seeing her in person, that care was rapidly deepening into something more profound. "Fight, Fiona," he whispered as he gently placed a fresh compress on her forehead. "You've come too far to give up now." Throughout the night, Xavier and Mrs. Hendricks took turns watching over Fiona. They spooned sips of water between her parched lips, changed the compresses, and listened anxiously to her breathing. Sometimes she would mutter in her fever dreams, calling out names Xavier didn't recognize or pleading with unseen figures. Each time he would take her hand and speak soothingly until she quieted. Dawn found Xavier dozing in the chair, his hand still clasping Fiona's. A soft touch on his shoulder startled him awake. "Xavier," Mrs. Hendricks said quietly, "her fever's broken." Xavier blinked the sleep from his eyes and looked at Fiona. The flush had receded from her cheeks and her breathing seemed easier. When he placed his hand on her forehead, her skin was cool and slightly damp. "Thank God," he breathed, relief washing over him. As if his words had reached her, Fiona's eyelids fluttered open. For a moment, confusion clouded her hazel eyes as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. Then her gaze settled on Xavier and recognition dawned. "Xavier," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I'm here," he assured her, squeezing her hand gently. "You gave us quite a scare, Fiona." "I'm sorry," she said, attempting to sit up but falling back weakly. "This isn't how I wanted to meet you." Xavier smiled, the tension of the night finally easing from his shoulders. "I'm just glad you're here and that you're going to be all right." Mrs. Hendricks approached the bed with a cup of broth. "Here, dear, try to drink a little of this. You need your strength." With Xavier's help, Fiona managed to sip some of the warm liquid. Each swallow seemed to pain her, but she persisted until half the cup was empty. "How long have I been here?" she asked, settling back against the pillows. Just one night, Xavier told her. You arrived yesterday afternoon on the stage from Little Rock. The last thing I remember clearly is getting on that stage, Fiona admitted. Everything after that is a blur of heat and motion. She looked around the small room. Is this your home? It's my place in town, Xavier explained. My ranch is about 10 miles outside of Bentonville. This is just somewhere I stay when business keeps me in town. He hesitated, then added, Mrs. Hendricks has been here as chaperone. Your reputation is safe. A slight smile touched Fiona's lips. My reputation seems the least of my concerns at the moment, but thank you for your consideration. Doc Sullivan arrived shortly after, his medical bag in hand and a concerned frown on his face. His expression lightened when he saw Fiona awake and alert. Well now, this is a promising sign, he said, approaching the bed. How are you feeling, Miss Zeller? Weak, Fiona admitted. And my throat feels like I've swallowed glass, but the room has stopped spinning, which is an improvement. The doctor chuckled as he examined her, checking her pulse and listening to her breathing. You had a nasty bout of fever, likely brought on by exhaustion and the poor conditions on those stage coaches. But your lungs sound clear, which is good news. No pneumonia developing. How long until she's recovered? Xavier asked, hovering anxiously nearby. Hard to say for certain, Doc Sullivan replied, packing away his stethoscope. She's young and appears to have been healthy before this illness. With proper rest and nourishment, perhaps a week or two before she's fully herself again, but she shouldn't be moved for at least a few days. Xavier nodded, decision made. Then she'll stay here. I'll remain in town to look after her. I can't impose, Fiona protested weakly. Surely you have responsibilities at your ranch. Nothing that can't wait, Xavier assured her. My foreman, Tom, can handle things for a while. Your health is more important. Doc Sullivan left a bottle of tonic for Fiona to take morning and night, with stern instructions about rest and proper nutrition. Mrs. Hendricks promised to bring food from her home and to continue acting as chaperone during Fiona's recovery. As the day progressed, Fiona drifted in and out of sleep. When awake, she was increasingly lucid, though still very weak. Xavier took advantage of one of her longer periods of wakefulness to bring in her trunk, which had been delivered from the stagecoach station. Would you like me to unpack some of your things? He asked, uncertain about invading her privacy but wanting her to have familiar comforts around her. Fiona hesitated, then nodded. There should be a book on top, a collection of poetry by Emily Dickinson, and perhaps my hairbrush. I must look a fright. Xavier opened the trunk and found the book where she had said it would be, its leather binding worn from frequent handling. Beneath it was a silver-backed hairbrush and mirror set that looked like an heirloom. Here, he said, bringing both items to her. And you look fine, considering what you've been through. Fiona accepted the book with a grateful smile but seemed too weak to attempt brushing her hair. Without thinking, Xavier sat on the edge of the bed and took the brush from her hands. May I? He asked, suddenly aware of the intimacy of what he was proposing. Fiona's eyes widened slightly, but then she nodded, turning her head to give him access to her tangled locks. With gentle strokes, Xavier began working through the knots in her chestnut hair. It was longer than he had realized, falling well past her shoulders when not pinned up. You have a gentle touch for a cowboy, Fiona observed quietly. Xavier smiled. I've helped deliver foals and calves. You learn to be careful with fragile things. Am I a fragile thing, Mr. Quentin? She asked, a hint of challenge in her voice despite her weakness. Right now, yes, he replied honestly, but I suspect under normal circumstances you're anything but fragile, Miss Zeller. She seemed pleased with his answer, relaxing as he continued to brush her hair in long, soothing strokes. In your letters, you mentioned that you've been in Arkansas for 8 years. Where were you before that? Missouri originally, Xavier told her. My family had a small farm there. After my parents died, fever took them both in the same week. I decided to head west. Worked as a ranch hand for a few years, saved every penny and eventually bought my own place. He paused, remembering. It wasn't much at first, just 100 acres and a cabin that leaked when it rained, but I've added to it over time. How large is it now?" Fiona asked, her eyelids growing heavy despite her evident interest. 800 acres, Xavier said with quiet pride. Good grazing land mostly, but there's a section I've cleared for crops. The house is decent, 4 rooms downstairs, 2 up. Nothing fancy but solid, doesn't leak anymore. Fiona smiled, her eyes closing. "It sounds wonderful," she murmured before sleep claimed her once more. Xavier sat for a moment, watching her peaceful face. Something warm unfurled in his chest, hope, perhaps that once she recovered, she might truly find happiness in the life he was offering. The next few days fell into a gentle rhythm. Xavier would wake early, check on Fiona, then handle whatever business needed his attention in town, always returning to the apartment by midday. Mrs. Hendricks would come in the mornings and evenings, bringing food and staying while Xavier stepped out for his own meals or to visit the livery where he was boarding his horse. Fiona grew stronger each day. By the 3rd day, she was able to sit up in bed for extended periods, and by the 5th, she managed to walk slowly around the small apartment, leaning on Xavier's arm. They talked for hours, delving deeper into the subjects they had touched on in their letters, books they had read, places they had seen, dreams they harbored for the future. Xavier learned that Fiona had been working as a schoolteacher in Philadelphia, until her position was eliminated when the school consolidated with another. With no family ties to hold her, her parents had died years earlier, and her only brother had moved to California. She had decided to answer Xavier's advertisement. "I had other offers," she admitted as they sat by the window on the 6th day, watching the activity in the street below. "Men from New York, Boston, even Chicago, but your letters were different." "Different how?" Xavier asked, genuinely curious. Fiona considered her answer carefully. "You didn't just write about what you wanted in a wife or what you could provide. You wrote about the land, the sky, the way the light changes over the fields at dusk. You described building something meaningful, not just acquiring a helper." She smiled shyly. "And you asked questions about me, real questions, not just whether I could cook or so." Xavier felt his face warm. "I wanted to know the woman I was asking to share my life, not just her qualifications." "That's exactly why I chose you," Fiona said softly. Their eyes met, and for a moment Xavier thought about leaning forward to kiss her. But he restrained himself, remembering that she was still recovering, that they were not yet married, that he had promised to be a gentleman. Instead, he cleared his throat and changed the subject. "Doc Sullivan says you're well enough to travel to the ranch in another day or 2 if you feel up to it. But if you'd rather stay in town a bit longer, get to know Bentonville first, that's fine too." "I'd like to see the ranch," Fiona decided. "After all, that's to be my home." The word home on her lips sent a surge of pleasure through Xavier. "Then we'll go the day after tomorrow if the weather holds. It's a beautiful ride this time of year. The sumac is just starting to turn red along the creek beds." As promised, 2 days later, Xavier helped Fiona into the buckboard wagon he had borrowed from the livery. She was still pale but insisted she felt strong enough for the journey. Mrs. Hendricks had helped her dress in a simple skirt and shirtwaist, and her hair was neatly pinned beneath a straw bonnet to shield her from the sun. "Are you sure about this?" Xavier asked one last time as he tucked a blanket around her legs. "We can wait another day if you need more time." "I'm sure," Fiona said firmly. "I've been cooped up in that apartment long enough. Some fresh air will do me good." Doc Sullivan had come to give his approval for the journey and provided a small bottle of tonic for Fiona to continue taking. "Just take it easy," he advised. "Don't try to do too much too soon." The road out of Bentonville wound through rolling hills covered in late summer wildflowers and tall prairie grasses. Fiona sat quietly beside Xavier, her eyes wide as she took in the landscape so different from the crowded streets of Philadelphia. "It's so vast," she breathed. "In your letters you tried to describe it, but I couldn't quite picture it until now." Xavier smiled, seeing his familiar surroundings through her fresh perspective. Wait until you see the view from the north pasture. On a clear day, you can see for miles. They passed several farms and smaller ranches, and Xavier pointed out landmarks along the way, the creek where the best fishing could be found, the stand of hickory trees where wild turkeys roosted, the meadow that bloomed with bluebonnets in the spring. Finally, they crested a hill and Xavier reined in the horses. "There it is," he said, unable to keep the pride from his voice. Quentin Ranch. Below them stretched a valley, green with late summer growth. A two-story house painted white with dark green trim stood near a cluster of outbuildings, a barn, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, and various sheds. A corral near the barn held several horses, and in the distance, cattle grazed in fenced pastures. A creek wound through the property, lined with cottonwoods and willows that offered shade in the hot Arkansas sun. "Oh, Xavier," Fiona whispered, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "It's beautiful." Xavier felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a worry he hadn't fully acknowledged until that moment. "You really think so?" "Yes," she said simply. "It feels like it could be home." Xavier flicked the reins and the horses started down the hill toward the ranch. As they approached, a man emerged from the barn, shading his eyes against the sun. When he recognized the wagon, he waved enthusiastically. "That's Tom," Xavier explained. "My foreman. He's been with me almost from the beginning." Tom jogged over as Xavier brought the wagon to a stop in front of the house. He was a weathered man in his 40s, with a friendly face and calloused hands that spoke of years of hard work. "Welcome back, boss," he called, then tipped his hat to Fiona. "And you must be Miss Zeller. Heard you had a rough start in Bentonville. Glad to see you're feeling better." "Thank you, mister." Fiona trailed off, looking to Xavier. "Tom Holcomb," Xavier supplied. "Best ranch hand in the county, though don't tell him I said so. His head's big enough already." Tom laughed good-naturedly. "I'll unhitch the team for you, Mrs. Holcomb's been cooking up a storm since we heard you were bringing Miss Zeller today. She's waiting inside." Xavier helped Fiona down from the wagon, keeping a steadying hand at her elbow when she swayed slightly. "Tom's wife, Sarah, has been keeping the house for me," he explained as they walked toward the front porch. "She and Tom live in a small cabin just behind the bunkhouse. She's excited to meet you." The house was larger than it had appeared from a distance, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and one side. The front door stood open, allowing a pleasant breeze to flow through the screen door. "Hello," Xavier called as he helped Fiona inside. "Sarah." A plump, cheerful woman in her 40s emerged from what Fiona assumed was the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her face lit up with a warm smile when she saw them. "There you are. I was beginning to think you'd changed your mind about coming today." She approached Fiona with her hands outstretched. "I'm Sarah Holcomb. So pleased to finally meet you, Miss Zeller. Xavier's been talking about nothing else for months." Fiona took the offered hands, smiling despite her fatigue. "Please call me Fiona, and thank you for preparing the house. It looks lovely." Indeed, the front parlor was spotlessly clean, with fresh wildflowers in a vase on the side table and curtains that looked recently washed fluttering in the breeze. "Oh, this is nothing," Sarah said, waving off the compliment. "I've been itching to really set this place to rights for years, but Xavier here always said to leave things as they were." She gave Xavier a fond but exasperated look. Men have no notion of what makes a house a home. Xavier shrugged, not denying the accusation. "I figured that should be up to my wife when I found her." The simple statement hung in the air between them, a reminder of why Fiona had come to Arkansas in the first place. She felt a blush rise to her cheeks, but was saved from responding by a sudden wave of dizziness that had her clutching Xavier's arm for support. "You need to rest," Xavier said immediately, concern evident in his voice. "The journey was too much too soon." "I'm fine," Fiona protested, though she didn't resist as he led her to a comfortable armchair. "Just a little lightheaded. It will pass." Sarah bustled off to fetch a glass of cool water and a damp cloth for Fiona's forehead while Xavier knelt beside the chair, his brow furrowed with worry. "We should have waited another day," he said, taking her hand in his. "I shouldn't have rushed you." "You didn't rush me," Fiona assured him, touched by his concern. "I wanted to come, and now that I'm here, I'm glad we didn't wait." She looked around the parlor with its sturdy furniture and simple but pleasant appointments. "I want to see the rest of the house when I've caught my breath. After all, I need to know what I'm working with." Xavier chuckled, relief evident in his expression. "There will be plenty of time for that. For now, just rest." "Doctor's orders, remember?" Sarah returned with the water and cloth, then insisted on serving an early supper so that Fiona could retire early. The meal was simple but delicious: fried chicken, fresh corn, biscuits still warm from the oven, and apple pie for dessert. "Sarah's the best cook in the county," Xavier said as he helped himself to a second piece of pie. "I'll miss her cooking when she stops working here." Sarah paused in clearing the dishes. "Who said anything about stopping? Miss Fiona, I mean, Mrs. Quentin, once you're married, will need help with a place this size, at least at first. Unless you don't want me around, of course," she added, looking uncertainly at Fiona. "I would be grateful for your help," Fiona said quickly. "I've never managed a household this large before. And please, continue to call me Fiona." After supper, despite her protests that she could manage on her own, Xavier carried Fiona upstairs to what would be her bedroom until they were married. It was a pleasant room with a large window overlooking the creek and the pastures beyond. A four-poster bed with a colorful quilt dominated the space, and a dressing table with a mirror stood against one wall. Sarah aired it out and put fresh linens on the bed, Xavier said as he set her down gently. "My room is across the hall if you need anything during the night." He hesitated, then added, "Once we're married, this will be our room if that's agreeable to you, but for now I want you to have your privacy." Fiona nodded, touched by his consideration. "Thank you, Xavier, for everything. I know this isn't how either of us imagined our first days together would be." "No," he agreed with a rueful smile. "But I'm glad you're here, Fiona, even if the circumstances aren't what we planned." He left her then, closing the door softly behind him. Fiona sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the past week. She had arrived in Bentonville expecting to marry a stranger, only to fall desperately ill. Instead of a wedding, she had experienced Xavier's gentle care, his unwavering support, and his obvious concern for her well-being. And now she was in his home, soon to be their home, still weak from her illness, but increasingly certain that she had made the right choice in accepting his proposal. The Xavier she was coming to know was even better than the man who had written those thoughtful letters. With a contented sigh, Fiona changed into her nightgown and slipped beneath the cool sheets, falling asleep to the distant sound of cattle lowing in the pastures and the gentle rustle of wind in the cottonwoods outside her window. The next morning, Fiona woke feeling stronger than she had since falling ill. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting patterns on the wooden floor. She rose slowly, testing her strength, and was pleased to find that the dizziness that had plagued her seemed to have subsided. After washing and dressing in a simple blue skirt and white shirtwaist, she made her way carefully down the stairs, one hand on the banister. The smell of coffee and bacon guided her to the kitchen, where she found Xavier sitting at a large table, a cup of coffee in front of him and a newspaper spread open. He looked up at her entrance, surprise and pleasure lighting his features. "Good morning. I didn't expect you to be up so early." "How are you feeling?" "Much better," Fiona said truthfully, accepting the chair he pulled out for her. "I think a good night's sleep in a real bed was exactly what I needed." Sarah appeared from the pantry, beaming when she saw Fiona. "There you are, my dear. Sit right down and I'll fix you some breakfast. How do you like your eggs?" "However is easiest," Fiona replied, not wanting to be a bother. Xavier chuckled. "Sarah's asking your preference, not offering to go out of her way. She's already cooking breakfast for 5 ranch hands and us." "Oh. In that case, I prefer them over easy if it's not too much trouble." Fiona amended, feeling her cheeks warm. Sarah patted her shoulder as she passed. No trouble at all, dear. It's nice to have a woman to cook for instead of just these hungry men who wouldn't know the difference between a soufflé and a scrambled egg. Breakfast was a hearty affair: eggs, bacon, biscuits with honey, and strong coffee. Fiona ate more than she had in days, surprising herself with her appetite. Would you like to see the ranch today? Xavier asked as they lingered over second cups of coffee. Not all of it, that would be too much even if you were fully recovered. But perhaps a short tour of the house and the immediate grounds. I'd like that very much, Fiona agreed eagerly. Xavier proved to be a thorough guide, showing her through the entire house, the parlor and dining room she had already seen, the study where he kept the ranch accounts, a small library with shelves half filled with books, plenty of room for your collection, he noted, and the kitchen with its large hearth and ample storage. Upstairs, besides the bedrooms, there was a small sitting room that caught the morning light. This could be your private space, Xavier suggested as they stood in the sunny room. For reading or writing letters or whatever you like. Fiona turned to him, touched by his thoughtfulness. You've thought of everything, haven't you? Xavier shrugged, looking slightly embarrassed. I wanted you to feel welcome, to have spaces that are yours. After touring the house, they ventured outside. Xavier showed her the kitchen garden where Sarah grew vegetables and herbs, the chicken coop, and the smokehouse. They walked slowly, Xavier matching his pace to Fiona's still limited strength, his hand never far from her elbow when the ground grew uneven. At the barn, they paused to rest, sitting on a bench in the shade. Xavier pointed out the various buildings and explained their functions: the bunkhouse where the ranch hands slept, the forge where the blacksmith work was done, the corrals for breaking horses. It's a working ranch, he said, a note of apology in his voice. Not as refined as what you might be used to in Philadelphia. It's wonderful, Fiona assured him, so full of life and purpose. In Philadelphia, I lived in a small apartment and taught in a crowded schoolhouse. This, she gestured to the open space around them, this is freedom. Xavier's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. I was hoping you'd see it that way. Not everyone appreciates the solitude out here. Is it very solitary in winter? Fiona asked, suddenly wondering what the harsh season would bring. It can be, Xavier admitted. The snow sometimes makes the roads impassable for a week or more at a time, but the house is warm and there's always work to be done inside when the weather's bad. He hesitated, then added, and now there will be company, if you still want to stay, that is. Fiona turned to face him fully, surprised by the uncertainty in his voice. Why wouldn't I want to stay? Xavier looked down at his hands, calloused and strong from years of ranch work. This isn't what you signed up for: arriving sick, being nursed back to health by a stranger, seeing the ranch at its busiest and most chaotic time of year. I'd understand if you wanted to take more time before committing to marriage, or even if you decided this life isn't for you after all. Fiona reached out and placed her hand over his, the bold gesture surprising them both. Xavier, I came here because your letters showed me a man of integrity, kindness, and quiet strength. A man who built something meaningful with his own hands and wanted to share it with someone who would appreciate it. This past week has only confirmed what I suspected from your letters. She took a deep breath. I still want to marry you if you'll have me. Xavier turned his hand to clasp hers, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. I'll have you, Fiona Zeller. I'll have you and count myself the luckiest man in Arkansas. For a moment they sat in silence, hands joined, the promise of a future together hanging in the air between them. Then Xavier cleared his throat and stood, helping Fiona to her feet. You should rest before lunch, he said, his voice slightly gruff with emotion. We can talk to the Reverend about the wedding when you're fully recovered. The next week passed in a pleasant haze as Fiona's strength returned day by day. She began to take on small tasks around the house, arranging flowers from the garden, helping Sarah with simple cooking tasks. organizing the small library. Xavier was often busy with ranch work during the day, but he always made time to sit with her in the evenings, telling her about his day and asking about hers. They decided to set the wedding date for October 10th, just over 2 weeks away. It would be a small ceremony at the ranch, with only the ranch hands, a few neighbors, and the Reverend from Bentonville in attendance. "I wish I had family to invite," Fiona said wistfully as they discussed the arrangements one evening. "My brother Michael is in California, and I have no idea how to reach him." Xavier hesitated, then reached for her hand. "We can be each other's family now if you'll allow it, and perhaps in time we might add to that family." Fiona blushed deeply but didn't pull her hand away. "I'd like that," she said softly. As the wedding day approached, Fiona threw herself into preparations with increasing energy. She and Sarah rode into Bentonville to purchase fabric for a wedding dress, a simple but elegant design in ivory satin that Sarah helped her sew. The women of neighboring ranches, curious about Xavier Quentin's Eastern bride, began to visit, bringing food and wedding gifts and offers of help. Fiona found herself warming to the frontier hospitality, so different from the reserved politeness of Philadelphia society. These women spoke plainly, laughed loudly, and offered friendship without pretense. By the time the wedding day arrived, Fiona had begun to feel that she might truly belong in this new community. The morning of October 10th dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for an autumn wedding. Sarah helped Fiona dress in the new gown, arranging her hair in a simple but elegant style adorned with white prairie roses from the garden. "You look beautiful," Sarah said, her eyes suspiciously bright as she stepped back to admire her handiwork. "Xavier won't know what hit him." Downstairs, guests had begun to arrive. The parlor had been rearranged to create a space for the ceremony, with chairs borrowed from neighbors set in rows and fall flowers decorating every available surface. The Reverend, a kindly older man named Josiah Thompson, waited at the front of the room, Bible in hand. Xavier stood beside him, looking uncharacteristically nervous in his best suit, a dark gray wool with a crisp white shirt and string tie. He kept tugging at his collar and shifting his weight from foot to foot, until Tom clapped him on the shoulder and murmured something that made him laugh and relax slightly. When the small gathering was seated and a neighbor's daughter had begun to play a hymn on the portable organ brought for the occasion, Fiona descended the stairs. The room fell silent as she appeared, and all eyes turned to her. But she saw only Xavier, whose expression transformed from nervous anticipation to awestruck wonder. He stepped forward to meet her at the bottom of the stairs, offering his arm with a smile that seemed to light him from within. "You're breathtaking," he whispered as she placed her hand on his arm. Together, they walked to where Reverend Thompson waited. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, with traditional vows that echoed in the sunlit parlor as Fiona and Xavier pledged themselves to one another. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Xavier's kiss was gentle, but held a promise that made Fiona's heart race. The celebration that followed was joyous, a feast prepared by Sarah and the neighboring women, music provided by several ranch hands who turned out to be accomplished fiddle and banjo players, and dancing that continued well into the evening. Fiona found herself passed from partner to partner as everyone wanted a turn with the bride, but she always returned to Xavier, whose eyes rarely left her throughout the festivities. As night fell, the guests began to depart, calling good wishes and occasionally ribald jokes that made Fiona blush and Xavier shake his head in mock disapproval. Finally, only the ranch hands remained, and they too made their way to the bunkhouse after helping to clear away the remnants of the celebration. Xavier and Fiona stood on the porch, watching the last of the lanterns disappear toward the bunkhouse. The October air had grown chilly, and Xavier wrapped an arm around Fiona's shoulders, drawing her close to his warmth. "Are you happy, Mrs. Quentin?" he asked softly. Fiona looked up at him, at this man who had shown her nothing but kindness and consideration since her arrival. "Very happy, Mr. Quentin," she replied, leaning into his embrace. Inside, the house seemed different, somehow quieter, more intimate. Xavier built up the fire in the parlor while Fiona changed out of her wedding dress. When she returned downstairs in her nightgown and robe, she found him waiting with 2 glasses of sherry. "I thought we might toast our marriage," he said, offering her a glass. "To new beginnings," he proposed once she had accepted it. "To new beginnings," Fiona echoed, sipping the sweet liquor. They sat together before the fire, talking quietly about the day, about their guests, about nothing of consequence. But beneath the casual conversation ran a current of anticipation, of awareness. When Xavier finally stood and offered his hand to help her up, Fiona's heart began to race. "Shall we retire?" he asked, his voice deeper than usual. Fiona nodded, suddenly shy despite the weeks of growing closeness between them. Xavier doused the lamps and banked the fire, then led her upstairs to what was now their bedroom. Inside, someone, Sarah, most likely had prepared the room for their wedding night. The bed was turned down, fresh flowers sat on the dressing table, and a single lamp burned low, casting soft shadows. Xavier closed the door behind them, and for a moment they stood in uncertain silence. Then he crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "Fiona," he began, his voice gentle, "I want you to know that I don't expect anything tonight. You were ill not so long ago, and I would understand if you need more time." Touched by his consideration, Fiona reached up to touch his face. "Xavier Quentin, I have never been surer of anything in my life than I am of you. I am your wife now, and I want to be your wife in every way." The kiss that followed was different from the chaste one they had shared at the ceremony, deeper, more urgent, filled with the promise of what was to come. When they finally drew apart, both were breathless. "I love you," Xavier said simply. "I think I began to love you through your letters, and these past weeks have only deepened that feeling." "And I love you," Fiona replied, the words feeling right, feeling true. "My cowboy who told me to rest as long as needed, who cared for me when I was a stranger, who made me feel at home in a place I'd never been." Their second kiss led to more, and soon they were lost in the discovery of each other, all shyness forgotten in the joy of their union. Later, as they lay wrapped in each other's arms, the moonlight spilling through the window to paint silver patterns on the floor, Fiona traced idle patterns on Xavier's chest with her fingertips. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his voice drowsy with contentment. "That I'm glad I was brave enough to answer your advertisement," she replied honestly. "That even though I arrived sick and our beginning wasn't what we planned, I wouldn't change it now." Xavier caught her hand and brought it to his lips, kissing her palm. "Nor would I. Your illness gave me the chance to care for you, to show you that I could be trusted with your vulnerability. And it gave us time to truly know each other before we made our vows." Fiona nestled closer to his warmth. "Do you think we would have married so quickly if I hadn't been ill?" "Probably," Xavier admitted with a chuckle. "I knew from your letters that you were the woman I wanted to marry. Seeing you in person only confirmed it, even when you were pale with fever and barely conscious." "How romantic," Fiona teased, poking him gently in the ribs. "It was romantic," Xavier insisted, rolling to face her. "Because even then, all I could think about was making you comfortable, helping you heal, giving you a reason to stay once you recovered." Fiona's smile softened. "You certainly succeeded. I can't imagine being anywhere else now." As winter descended on the ranch, Fiona settled into her role as Xavier's wife and the mistress of Quentin Ranch. The days grew shorter and colder, but the house remained warm and bright with activity. Fiona took over much of the household management from Sarah, though the older woman still came daily to help with the heavier tasks and to teach Fiona the peculiarities of cooking on a wood-burning stove. Xavier showed Fiona how to ride, starting with the gentlest mare in the stable, and soon they were taking short rides together around the property when weather permitted. He taught her about the cattle business, explaining the yearly cycle of calving, branding, and driving to market. She absorbed it all eagerly, asking questions and offering observations that sometimes surprised him with their insight. In turn, Fiona brought new life to the house. She finished organizing the library and added her own books to the shelves. She started a small indoor herb garden in the kitchen window. She taught Xavier to play chess in the evenings, and though he claimed to be hopeless at it, he won suspiciously often for a beginner. Their physical relationship blossomed as well, their initial shyness giving way to a deep passion that sometimes left them both wondering how they had ever lived without each other's touch. The first heavy snow came in early December, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. Fiona stood at the window of their bedroom, watching the flakes swirl in the pre-dawn light when she felt Xavier's arms encircle her from behind. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he murmured, his chin resting on top of her head. She agreed, leaning back against his chest. "Though a bit daunting." "Will we be snowed in?" "Probably for a day or two," Xavier admitted. "But we're well prepared. The cellars are full, the woodpiles are stocked, and the animals are sheltered." He turned her in his arms to face him. "And I can think of worse fates than being trapped in this house with you, Mrs. Quentin." Fiona smiled up at him, still marveling sometimes at the turn her life had taken. "As can I, Mr. Quentin." They were indeed snowed in for 3 days, during which time they read aloud to each other, played chess, baked bread, and made love with the unhurried enjoyment of those who knew they had nowhere else to be. On the morning of the 4th day, Fiona woke feeling strangely queasy. She dismissed it as nothing, but when the same feeling returned the next morning and the next, she began to suspect the cause. She waited until she was certain before telling Xavier. On Christmas Eve, as they sat before the fire after supper, she handed him a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a red ribbon. "It's not Christmas yet," he protested, though he accepted the gift with a smile. "This one can't wait," Fiona said, her heart pounding with excitement and nervousness. Xavier untied the ribbon and unwrapped the paper to reveal a tiny pair of knitted booties, so small they fit in the palm of his hand. He stared at them uncomprehendingly for a moment, then his eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Fiona," he whispered, looking up at her with wonder. "Are you?" She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Xavier set the booties carefully on the side table, then pulled Fiona into his arms, holding her as if she were made of glass. "When?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Dr. Sullivan says late June, most likely," Fiona told him, pulling back to see his face. "Are you happy?" "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Xavier said, his eyes suspiciously bright in the firelight. "Fiona, you've already given me more joy than I ever thought possible, and now this?" He shook his head in wonder. "I don't know what I did to deserve you, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the gift you've given me." The winter passed in a blur of preparations. As Fiona's body changed with the growing life inside her, Xavier became even more attentive, insisting she rest often and bringing her special treats from town when the roads were passable. The news of their impending parenthood spread quickly through the small community, and soon gifts began to arrive: a handmade quilt from a neighboring rancher's wife, a carved wooden cradle from Tom Holcomb, tiny gowns sewn by the women of Bentonville. Spring brought new calves to the ranch, and a roundness to Fiona's figure that made Xavier gaze at her with undisguised adoration. They converted the small room next to their bedroom into a nursery, painting the walls a soft yellow that reminded Fiona of the wildflowers that had been blooming when she first arrived in Arkansas. As her due date approached, Fiona found herself thinking often of her arrival in Bentonville, how ill she had been, how Xavier had cared for her without hesitation, how their unusual beginning had set the tone for their relationship. She mentioned this to Xavier one evening as they sat on the porch watching the summer sunset. "I was so afraid when I got on that stagecoach in Philadelphia," she admitted. "Afraid I was making a terrible mistake, that you wouldn't be the man your letters suggested, that I would be trapped in a loveless marriage in a strange place." Xavier took her hand, rubbing his thumb over her knuckles in the way she had come to find so comforting. "And instead, Instead, I found everything I never knew I was looking for, Fiona said, placing their joined hands over the swell of her belly where their child grew. A home, a purpose, a love I never thought possible. Even though you arrived sick and miserable, Xavier teased gently. Especially because of that, Fiona said seriously. Because you showed me who you truly were from the very beginning, a man who would care for me at my weakest, who would tell me to rest as long as needed, who would put my welfare above his own convenience. She smiled at him, her eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. How could I not fall in love with such a man? Their son, Samuel Michael Quentin, was born on a warm June evening just as the fireflies were beginning to rise from the meadow grass. He had Xavier's dark hair and Fiona's hazel eyes, and from his first cry he held both his parents' hearts in his tiny hands. As Xavier placed their son in Fiona's arms for the first time, she looked up at her husband, exhausted but radiant with joy. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" Xavier asked, perching on the edge of the bed to gaze in wonder at the tiny being they had created together. "For taking care of me when I arrived sick from the journey," Fiona said, echoing the words that had begun their story. "For telling me to rest as long as needed. For giving me the time and space to heal, to know you, to fall in love with you." Xavier leaned down to kiss her forehead, then their son's. "I think we took care of each other," he said softly, "and now we'll take care of him together." As the years passed, the Quentin family grew and prospered. Samuel was joined by a sister, Emma, 2 years later, and then by another brother, William, 3 years after that. The ranch expanded as well, with new pastures cleared and additional cattle added to the herds. Xavier's reputation as a fair dealer and skilled rancher spread throughout the region, bringing new business opportunities and respect within the community. Fiona found her own place in Bentonville society, eventually starting a small school on the ranch for their children and those of neighboring families. Her quiet intelligence and genuine warmth made her a valued friend and advisor to many, and she never forgot the kindness shown to her when she first arrived ill and uncertain. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised Fiona with a trip to Philadelphia to visit her old friends and to show their children the city where their mother had once lived. The journey was long but comfortable, far different from the stagecoach ride that had brought Fiona to Arkansas a decade earlier. As they stood on the platform of the Philadelphia train station, their 3 children wide-eyed with excitement at the bustle of the big city, Xavier squeezed Fiona's hand. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly, knowing she would understand the question. Fiona looked at him at the laugh lines around his eyes, the touch of silver at his temples, the face she had woken up to for 10 years and hoped to wake up to for decades more, and shook her head. "Not one," she said firmly. "Every step of the journey brought me to where I was meant to be." Xavier's smile was as warm and reassuring as it had been on the day they met, when he had carried her fevered body to safety and promised to care for her until she healed. "Then let's continue the journey together," he said, "wherever it may lead." Hand in hand, they followed their children into the bustling city, secure in the knowledge that no matter what adventures lay ahead, they would face them as they had faced every challenge since that fateful day in Bentonville together, with love, with courage, and with the unwavering support they had promised each other from the beginning. And in the years that followed, as their children grew and the 19th century gave way to the 20th, as the ranch thrived and their love deepened with each passing season, Fiona and Xavier Quentin never forgot how their story began with a sick bride, a caring cowboy, and words that became the foundation of their life together. "Rest as long as needed."